3 years. And with that, I'll give you Lon Povich.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be here to talk about crisis management. I really had two thoughts about crisis management when I was asked to do this presentation. First, you probably all know a lot more about crisis management than I do, and the speakers today certainly know a lot more about it. But on the other hand, crisis management is really what I do as my day job these days, every single day. So I'll try to do three things. I'll tell you a little bit about the three experiences I've had in the general counsel role, at BCG, at BJ's, and in the governor's office. I'll tell you the 5 or 6 things that I'm sure you'll hear about today that every crisis management team should think about. And then I'll go through 3 experiences, one at each of the 3 places I work, the Boston Consulting Group, BJ's, and the governor's office, and talk about crises and how they were managed and what we learned, and in the case of the governor's office, what we continue to learn. So by way of background, chronologically, the first place I worked when I was in the governor's office early in my career for 2 years after the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I went out and I went into an in-house role at the Boston Consulting Group. And BCG is a major strategy consulting firm, plays in the same space as McKinsey and Bain and BCG. And their clients are the largest companies in the world, very global. When I left, there were 52 offices in 37 countries. And it's a very competitive space, the big 3, Accenture, LEK, all the other firms. And all they're selling is their intellectual property, the idea of their brand, that they can give better and more thoughtful and smarter advice. So the brand is very important. There's no product there. It was a privately held company, a lot like a big international law firm. They had partners who owned the equity. So there were no shareholders, and there were virtually no regulators because it wasn't publicly traded, and it didn't operate in that kind of space. After about 11 years there, I moved over to BJ's Wholesale Club, also a store in a 3-party industry: Costco, the best-run company in the world; Sam's Club, part of the biggest retailer; Walmart in the world; and little old BJ's out in Natick, Massachusetts. And as you know, they're membership-based formats. You pay so much money, you get a membership every year, and then you can shop in the store. And the product is mostly things you buy in the grocery store, along with what's called general merchandise: clothing, books, appliances, TVs, all that. The thing about BJ's, which is in fact heavily regulated both by the SEC and all the other government agencies, and by a host of local regulators and state regulators in the 200 stores and the 15 states, everything you buy at BJ's, you can buy somewhere else. Brand is important, but with the exception of a few house-branded items, their own stuff, the Cheerios you buy at BJ's, you can get anywhere else. The raisins you buy at BJ's, you can get anywhere else, et cetera, et cetera. So brand is very important there, but really quality is the thing that's so important there, because you can always go someplace else and get the product. Prices may change, but you can always go somewhere else. And of course, the place I now work is in the governor's legal office. And I've been there the entire term of the governor so far. It's been almost 4 years. And for those of you who are in lawyers' roles and general counsel's roles, it really is a lot like a general counsel role in which the business is politics or government. But it's a lot different than a general counsel role in a number of ways. First of all, almost every issue, because it's government, has legal issues surrounding it. Every day, and this was one of the original appeals to the job for me, and now is one of the real exhaustions of the job, but every day there are new issues. It's like you sit in a big room and there are lots of doors around all the say it's a round room, and doors around all the clock faces, and the doors open and people come in and go out constantly with new issues all the time. The cast of characters changes every day as the issues change. The issues move fast, really, really fast. And every issue has a counterparty, especially in this particular season we're in, who's always willing to disagree, to tell you that you did it wrong, to tell you your analysis was wrong, and to argue that the outcome was wrong. And again, every issue can end up in the media, unlike in private companies or even public companies. Especially in a campaign season, which seems to be quite constant, everything can come up in the media. So, and of course, if things go badly, they can reflect badly on you in a public way or badly on your client, the governor, in a public way. and as all politicians have to stand for re-election, the ramifications of bad judgments and mistakes and poorly handled crises can be even more extreme. So the places have all been different, from BCG to BJ's to the governor's office, really, really different. But I think, I break it down to 5 or 6 points that crises involve. So first of all, you need a plan, a generic plan about how you're going to handle a crisis. The crisis could be a storm, the crisis could be a product recall, the crisis could be the untimely passing or departure of a senior executive. All those things can be crises. But you need some plan in place to figure out how you're going to deal with a crisis. And I think the most important part of the generic plan is organization and communication. You need to know who the decision makers are. You need to know how you're going to access them. That's much easier these days than it was 20 years ago, because we all have 1 or 2 of these things in our pockets all the time, and people can be reached almost anywhere. I also have a satellite phone in my car that can be recharged from the sun with a little solar panel. But believe me, if we are so bad off that I am recharging my cellular phone from the sun, you're all on your own. But the first part is who's going to get together, who are going to be advisors, who are we going to get to on the media side, on the legal side, on the operation side. How are we going to pull all those people together? The second step after the crisis occurs is you need to gather facts. You need to gather them as quickly as possible, and you need to gather them again and again and again and again. Because especially when people are in crisis, they forget things. There are sometimes people who don't want to share things. You need to go back as quickly as you can and as relentlessly as you can to gather the key facts. When you gather those facts, you have to come up with a plan based on the best facts that you know at the time. But you have to be ready to be flexible in the plan, to reevaluate the plan, and to modify the plan as you continue to iterate with a plan and with facts. But what sort of gets in the way of the iteration is the need to communicate. You need to communicate to all the players in your world who are concerned with that crisis. And the most important point of all is you have to tell the truth. You have to tell the truth as you know it, if it's good news, if it's bad news, or it's in time will take to find out more news. Once you tell something that's not true, you lose all your credibility, you lose total control of the crisis. So you have to tell the truth. And these 3 points, gathering facts, executing a flexible plan, telling the truth about the plan, go around and around and around, depending on the length of the crisis. Some of the crises are just things that happen. You have to get through it, and recovery is pretty quick. The last thing I'll talk about is what's going on up in Lawrence and Andover, North Andover now. And that, the event, the first event, was pretty quick, over in a couple days. But the recovery from that event is going on and on and on and on. So that puts much more pressure on this loop of gathering facts, executing a plan, designing and executing a plan, and speaking the truth. And again, the truth is to all the audiences that matter. And finally, when the crisis is over, or you've gotten through the most difficult part, you need to sit down and figure out what you can learn from the crisis, what you can do to improve your generic plan, what you can do to improve individual points that may have led to the crisis, and how you want to go forward to deal with your business in the future. So those are the places I've worked, and those are my few thoughts on general crisis management. Now, I'd like to just look at those briefly through the lens of one example from each of the places. And remember, the places are very different, so all my points roll out differently. Very shortly before I came to Boston Consulting Group, for the first time, they had been sued by a client. The client alleged that BCG had sold them, or a group of young partners out of one of the Midwestern offices, had sold them too many projects and did not deliver on the promises associated with the projects. And remember, it's all about reputation at a place like BCG. It's all about reputation. And the worst possible reputation harm came from that crisis, because not only there was a lawsuit, which, fine, we have great lawyers who will deal with a lawsuit, it showed up literally on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. You know that Wall Street Journal test everyone talks about? This was it. The middle column, the one everybody looks at as soon as they look at the journal. So how was BCG going to deal with this crisis? Well, first of all, we didn't have a very good plan in place. The company was spread out all around the world. The executive committee was global. They came together once every month or so, someplace in the world. Conference calls were much harder to organize. So it really took a day or two just to get the right people and to retain the right advisors. Then we had to go gather the facts. You know, again, a lot more paper and a lot fewer electronic documents then than now, which in many ways is a good thing, but made fact gathering pretty hard. There were some incentives by some of the people who were alleged to have acted not with the best judgment, to take a while to get to tell all the facts and to act with candor. So that took a lot of time too. After we, went off and got our legal defense in place, we had to do the speaking, which was the hardest part. Because the speaking not only had to be to the client and to the lawsuit, it had to be to all the potential clients, to explain to them what had happened and how BCG had not acted inappropriately. It had to be to the staff, because the staff at a professional services firm is very mobile. And finally, it had to be to the recruits, because most of the people at a place like BCG wants to recruit, have offers at the investment banks or at McKinsey and Bain or at the hedge funds or the private equity world. So all those communications had to be done. That was the most challenging part of that crisis, was the communication. The crisis was not such that there were many external effects other than those which could be dealt with by communication. We tried to make that message repeat to the key constituencies over and over again as progress went on, and we tried to learn from it. We put in a risk management team, which actually reported to me for most of the time I was there. We put in more oversight on client projects. We put in triggers in the accounting system that would pop out if sales to one particular client seemed out of line. And we generally tried to manage the partners who had always been sort of their own little P&Ls, especially the young ones, with a little more care, so that this type of crisis, and again, it doesn't compare to the scope of what's happening in Lawrence, but it's certainly in a professional service firm viewed as a major transition point. Totally unprepared, all about communication. So what happened at BJ's? BJ's has no intellectual property. It sells food. So what's the worst thing that can happen if you sell food? The worst thing that can happen if you sell food is you sell hamburger that has E. coli in it. E. coli is a very bad thing. E. coli can kill people. Fortunately, no one in this case had that strong a response. And BJ's, because it's a highly centralized, highly organized company that has lots of hierarchical structures in it, was really able to react to the bad food crisis and the stories that came from it in a very quick and very organized way. Because we had the central management sitting in one place, we had good communications down to the clubs, as they're called, and people really were able to manage that quickly. There was also one other advantage that comes from the BJ's business model. That benefit is this whole membership system. Because if you have a membership system, you know what every member has bought. So once you isolated the product that was tainted, you could literally figure out which people had shopped for that product in those locations in the right time. And we literally sent people out door to door to retrieve the product, to do it. So this was a crisis that was mostly contained to the people who had actually purchased the product. But there were some news stories which we had to deal with. But it was because the company was so organized, so practiced, and so hierarchical that it could execute this recall in a way that mitigated the damage. And we did put in extra security measures after that. We did embed people in the manufacturers. We did a lot more random testing. But what we learned from that recall allowed us to put in place protocols, both communications and testing, that never allowed that thing so far to happen again. And it's been 5 years since they had the last recall of a product that could really cause great harm. But again, it was the same steps. Have a plan, which they had a good one. Gather the facts, which were easy to do because of the membership. Speak the truth. Go out and execute a plan that solves the problems, and learn from it to see what you can do. And the final example I'll give you is what's going on up in Lawrence and Andover and North Andover. I mean, the chief of staff and the senior political advisor and I meet once or twice a year, just routinely, with the head of the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. And it was that Thursday, the 15th or the 16th of September, we were meeting with him when all his phones started ringing and going off, along with the two deputies that were with him. And he looked at us, he said, you know, houses are burning and exploding in Lawrence and North Andover. I have to leave. So we were in that crisis from the very first moment of that. And I learned a couple things, or I'm learning a couple things in that experience. First of all, the good news is that as far as all this crisis management protocols go, the people who are first responders, who are in public safety situations, fire, police, rescue, they have awesome plans. They have awesome communications. You know, dozens of towns responded to Lawrence and Andover and North Andover in mutual aid when the 70 or so fires started breaking out. Police descended from all over in a very orderly and organized way. When we came into the governor's office, we had our first briefings on public safety, and like all teams of smart people, we sat around and thought, what about this, what about that, what about this? What I learned is the first responders, the mass emergency management and their teams, and the police and fire teams, they really have their organization set. And that piece worked out well. Within 48 hours, they turned off the gas, they turned off the power, they eventually turned the power back on, and the restoration part started. Now the restoration, you know, there were 8,000 meters that were impacted. So basically it was 50 miles of pipe down the street was impacted. There were 8,000 meters, so 8,000 service lines, they're called, that lead from the main pipes across into the meters. And then behind the meters, one or more house or apartment or school or nursing home or something behind the meters. So the first part of the plan, thought out, communicated, rolled out, we're going to do Project Temp Heat. Project Temp Heat, we're going to give heat, we're going to give heating units, electric heaters to everyone in these 8,000 places. It's going to keep them warm. Well, it was a great plan, but it didn't account for the fact that the electrical circuits in many of the units in Lawrence could not take, electric heaters. A lot of those places still have fuses that you screw in, right? They're totally below code. Also, the fire department didn't want the heaters moved from the space heaters moved from one part of the houses to the other. So that was the first plan, Project Temp Heat. We're going to get the National Guard out there. They're going to give out temporary heaters. It's a great idea, but it didn't work. Whether that was an inadequate fact gathering from the beginning, whether it was just an effort to communicate too quickly by the utility who put it in place, who knows? But when that plan didn't work, we had to move to the next plan. And the next plan was to replace an agreement, an understanding to replace all of the gas-driven furnaces, dryers, stoves, in all 8,000 of those locations. And they got in, they got the plumbers, they got the electricians, they got hundreds of people. They're all living on a cruise ship out in the harbor. But it turns out that it's, the original deadline, and again, every day there's an open briefing with the senior teams, and there's the mayors and city managers putting stuff up on the website all the time. But that project turned out to be harder than it was too, because it's turned out that every of the 8,000 units had its own story. So even though we put in place a plan to get plumbers from all over the country, get inspectors from all over Massachusetts, electricians from all over the country, it's had to be revised again recently, so that the deadline is now December 19th or something like that, instead of the middle of November. And there's been a huge effort to get 5,000, that's the real number, 5,000 housing units for people who want to move. There are warming stations and feeding stations, and there's, if I had much more time, or you had much more food, I could keep talking about it. But the point is that it changes over and over and over again. And when Lawrence is done, we'll reflect that we had a good plan on public safety. There's never been an event like this anyplace in the world, so the plan on how to deal with the restoration took a number of iterations to get right. But we had to remain flexible, and the governor and the other teams have been very candid in talking what's going on. But it's a tough situation where everybody in every home only has one question, which is, when does my heat come back on? But I really think that the 5 points, the planning, the fact gathering, the truth telling, the plan execution, and the learning, are things that drive you through every crisis. But I will just finish by telling one story that sort of defines my experience in this Lawrence thing, which is a very small story, and I don't mean to be glib about the discomfort that people are suffering through, or the poor fellow who was killed in the initial explosion. But for those of you who are lawyers in the room, you know that when you're an in-house counsel, mostly you end up, people say, can I do this or can I do that? And mostly you say, well, you can, but there are risks, You gotta be careful, counterparties. So, that's the kind of advice that lots of lawyers give lots of the time. But I really think that the finest moment, especially the finest crisis moment of my career, occurred around this Lawrence thing. So there's this big, the event on Thursday night. Friday, the command post is there. I say to the chief of staff, do I need to go to the command post? She says, no, go to the office. We'll call you if you need you. I think great lawyer thing, call you if you need you. And at 2 o'clock, the governor calls. And he says, Columbia Gas is not doing a good job with this electrical shutdown and repowering. I want to use Eversource. I want to use Eversource. Instead, can I just pull out Columbia Gas and put in Eversource? And I said, gee, I don't know. It's their utility, it's their lines. I don't know if you can do that. But it must take a state of emergency. So I go and I talk to a couple people in my office, and I say, figure out what we can do if we have a state of emergency. And I call the Department of Public Utilities, and I say, can we really do this? What does a state of emergency help? And then I say to the governor, okay, I'm coming up to Lawrence. And I'm driving up 93, and I am going as fast as I can. And I'm thinking, oh, I hope I get pulled over. I really want to get pulled over, Governor needs me. And I have 2 conference calls, one with the folks looking at the state of emergency and one with the DPU, and I merge it. And it turns out that if there's a state of emergency, you actually can, this is my red emergency powers folder, you actually can take away a utility's right to service its own line. Because there's a statute that says, upon a declaration by the governor that a state of emergency exists, the DPU may issue directives and order expenditures by investor-owned utilities necessary to respond to the state of emergency, including but not limited to expenditures for the deployment of personnel, equipment, or other assets of an alternative utility to assume responsibility for the restoration of service. So I walk into this command post, the governor's there, very much enraged about everything, and he says, well, and I said, Governor, you can do exactly what you want. And I had a state of emergency drafted by some people come up. I had the letter from the DPU came up, and we put Eversource in, and they dealt with the electrical system and the gas system until we had it stabilized. But, every so often, even in an emergency, there's a time that you get to play the role of the lawyer and get to give the advice that the client wants. So I hope that you avoid crises. I hope if you have crises, you have great advice, including legal advice. And I hope that the lawyers are able, like I was in that case, to give clear, decisive answer, which happens to be just what you want. So thank you very much. Let me take questions? Yeah. I'll take questions on anything you want, as long as it doesn't show up on Twitter, in Mass Lawyers Weekly, or anything else. Yes? The governor's lawyer. And what's the difference? I am the lawyer for the governor in his official capacity. So I give it, my team and I, Sharon Casey's here, who runs the Judicial Nominating Commission. We help pick judges. We review legislation. We draft veto messages. We supervise litigation. I am not his personal lawyer. If he needs a will or a trust, that's his. I am not his campaign lawyer. I advise the governor's staff on what they can do as state employees in campaign finance. But I'm the lawyer to the governor and his staff and lieutenant governor in their official capacity. I don't do anything on the political side. I mean, I haven't been, I don't think I've been to a meeting, and I don't even know where the campaign headquarters is. If the governor is accused of vetoing a bill that he can't veto, I'm in charge of that. If the governor is accused, the governor hasn't driven a car in 4 years, so this is a fine hypothetical. If the governor is like me, driving up 93 at 90 miles an hour, that's not my problem. Kinda. All right, good. All right, thank you very much. Have a good day.